Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Dark Rhino's Security Confidential. Today, we have a very special guest, and we're really honored and fortunate to have her. She is Michelle Wucker. She is a strategist, and she is an author. She's a best-selling author. She coined the term the Grey Rhino, and she coined that term for obvious, probable, impactful risks, which are surprisingly likely but not condemned to neglect. She's a former media and think tank executive. She is founder of the Chicago-based advisory firm Grey Rhino and Company. We love the name, by the way. She is the author of 4 books, including the influential global bestseller, The Grey Rhino, How to Recognize and Act on the Obvious Dangers We Ignore, and the newly released sequel, You Are What You Risk, The New Art and Science of Navigating an Uncertain World. Welcome to the show, Michelle. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted.
The name is beautiful. We love it. I'm sure we were before the broadcast here. We were talking a little bit about how we found our name. I'd like to understand how you came up with the Grey Rhino, and do a little role reversal here to kick us off.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I was in 2012. I was trying to find a way to talk about a big question that was on my mind, which was had to do with the difference between the Argentinian and the Greek debt crises. And without getting into too much detail, Argentina had a chance to turn things around. It was big and obvious. It was coming at it, and they didn't. And Greece, in spring of 2012, had just come to an agreement with its creditors after some very similar dynamics. And I was really curious about why, what made the difference. And I'd been really struggling with a way to talk about this that wasn't all debt geeky. I came from the finance world before I went into the policy world. And I was talking to a friend and I said, it's big, it's coming at you, it's scary. And that's when this sort of horn pointed at you kind of popped into my head. And it's like, it's 2 tons. So that was the Rhino. And, it's coming at you and it's giving you a choice of what you're going to do. And he made a joke about the black swan, which at the time was was being talked about all over the place in Wall Street as the completely improbable, unforeseeable thing that you just couldn't even predict because you couldn't even picture that it existed. And it became very badly misused after the financial crisis of 2007, 2009. Yep. Because there were things that a lot of people saw coming and said that they saw this coming, and people still didn't do anything. So, I didn't really want to come up with something derivative of the black swan, but he was like, oh, you could call it a black rhino. I was like, I don't want to do that. But isn't there something really called the black rhino? And, isn't there also a white rhino? I went to the zoo when I was 6 years old, and I don't really remember this,
All endangered species.
Yes. So I went to Wikipedia, and that's when I realized the black rhino is not black. The white rhino is not white. They're all gray, which is a really obvious thing that clearly is not getting its due because all the rhinos are called gray, but until now there wasn't anything called a gray rhino. So that was the part of the metaphor that says, look, there's this big scary thing coming at you that's giving you a choice, but you're more likely to miss the ball than you think, and you're more likely to get trampled than you think, but you're not condemned. You've got a choice, and I want you to take it. And the rhino's got just so much strength and force that often when I show a video of a rhino coming at you, the people in the room all collectively gasp. And that's really the emotional connection that I was trying to create. So, from policy, I know that you can't just tell someone, hey, this is a big problem. Here's all these spreadsheets and numbers that tell you how much value at risk and blah, 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 blah.
Right.
Unless they connect emotionally, they don't get it. And so I wanted to do sort of what Aesop did and, use an animal to create an emotional connection. And so that's how you got the Grey Rhino.
That's a fantastic story. I wish the picking of our name was as interesting, but the dark rhino, we are in the background. We see the animal as signifying a lot of strength and stability, and that's what we're trying to bring to our clients. We're trying to help them reduce their overall risk profiles. That's the number one thing that we're doing when we're engaging with them, and it just presented itself as it's a great icon and metaphor for that thought. So
I love it, and I have to say, after the book came out, I felt a little bit guilty about portraying the rhino as this big danger, because of course humans are more of a danger to rhinos than they are to
Yes.
us. And you talk about the strength of the rhino, and one of my points is that you've got three choices: you get trampled, you get out of the way, or you harness the strength of the rhino to help you. And that's really the direction that I try to push people when I talk about gray rhino crises and how to apply gray rhino theory to these big obvious problems.
Well, let's talk about that just briefly before we get into you are what you risk. And that is, in our world, in the world of cybersecurity, again, risk is the beginning point of all conversation. And how do you mitigate risk? But one of the things we encounter the gray rhino all the time. And the three choices that you outlined for us, it seems a lot of times companies, and I'm going to generalize because there's always exceptions out there, but their companies take the path of avoiding it. They don't. It's let's punt it down range. Let it be the status quo. What is the psychology behind that, or why would? What's your findings around that?
There's so many elements to that, and of course, of course, I wrote a whole book about it. But
You wrote a whole
but to sum
you hold
up,
several hundred pages, but
but to sum up, there are several reasons. One has to do with whether people believe they have the power to do something about it or not. And of course, you read a
okay,
lot of these stories about companies having done whatever and still got hacked. You read the stories about how hackers are getting stronger and stronger all the time, and there's all these surveys all the time about companies. How many companies think it's a big problem, and how many companies feel that they're prepared? I mean, there's a pretty big gap there. So that's
yes,
one. It's the whether you feel you have the ability to do something about it. The other part of it has to do with um, the way you perceive the risk or the threat. Humans are really bad at cost benefit analysis and at predicting, how risky something is. And there's also a part of our psychology that says if we see a big benefit in something,
yeah,
then we're going to see it as less risky than it really is. So if you're thinking, okay, I can put my money into marketing this big product or, doing whatever I want to put my money in, and that's where I'm focused on the money coming from, then my brain is going to automatically downplay the risks. And there's something called the optimism bias that, similarly, we tend to absorb information through rosy-eyed glasses better than information that we don't really want to hear. And then another part of it is that trying to head off a risk is risky in and of itself. Because if you do something to head off the risk and it works, then people are going to come back and say, "Oh, you're a Cassandra. This problem wasn't ever going to happen. So you were just, out there crying wolf and
right,
so you actually get punished for having prevented the thing from happening." And the other part of it has to do with groupthink. If there are people in a room, it depends on the background of the people in the room. But if people are very similar to each other, one person says something and then everyone around the room is going to pretty much repeat the same thing. And unless you've got a culture of really promoting structured debate and having devil's advocates and really questioning things, you're likely to just let things slip through. So it's a combination of factors, but that you're going to be focused more on where you're more likely to make money rather than where you're going to prevent losing money. And we've seen that calculation not work out for so many companies again and again and again.
yeah. And I think I'll say it that I think there's also a big emotions. A lot of times win out over logic. So if people are emotionally feeling that this is going to be a risk, this decision is a personal risk to them, a decision, even though it may be the right thing to do, they're not going to do it. They're going to go with the status quo. It's a safer choice.
Absolutely. And incentives are part of this too. That, if you're working at some company and you're kind of looking at what the next opportunity is down the road. You're hoping you get a promotion if you go to another company, and you look at the number of years that people are spending at each
Yeah.
job is shrinking and shrinking. So you're looking at the odds that this thing's going to blow up in your face or after you're gone. And if it blows up after you're gone, then there are no consequences. So I think there really are some perverse incentives out there.
Which and it at every level it gets tied to your own personal risk fingerprint, which is where we would love to get a great understanding from you. I read that your book, You Are What You Risk, with great interest. And as I mentioned, for me, it really helped me see the other side of the coin and see how people become a little bit more empathetic towards their appetites for risk, and maybe why they take a certain position. But let's start at the beginning here. What is an individual's risk fingerprint? Can you help define that?
Sure. So with a risk fingerprint, think of it like, at a crime scene. The wine glass with the fingerprint from the criminal, who put the poison into the wine glass to,
Yep.
and, the police are seeing, and there's an imprint on that wine glass. And think of that imprint as all of the risk choices that you've made, the ones that
Okay.
went well and the ones that didn't. So this is something that identifies you to the whole world, and it's unique, just like a real fingerprint is. So you look at the finger that made that print, and there are all sorts of influences that go into it. And similarly, the risk fingerprint is basically all of the factors that go into the risk decisions that you make that identify you to the world. And then with the risk fingerprint, they define you. So it's a combination of your innate personality, your experiences, your values, what you're willing to lose, what you're not willing to lose, your social and cultural environment, and even your physical environment, because there's some very interesting neurobiological influences on the kinds of risks that you take or not. And so just like a real fingerprint, you've got a set of different kinds of influences, and together those define you, and they tell the world who you are.
So I'm going to oversimplify this and ask a really dumb question here, but does nature or nurture win in defining your risk fingerprint? So,
Well, the answer is it depends. It depends. And there's a lot of debate, of course, on innate personality, but there are different parts of that. There's obviously your personality, like, who you are. Some people are more naturally anxious and other people more calm. Some people are more impulsive. Some people are more methodical. There's a tool called the risk type compass that I write about that actually measures some of that. And, as your environment is going to leave you, in one certain way. I mean, my parents have very different attitudes towards risk, which probably is why I'm so obsessed with with risk. But the people around you, you can change the people around you. And so that's a kind of influence, the nurture side of influence. Your experiences certainly change you. You cut your finger, and that like literally changes your fingerprint, but it also means that you're going to be a little more wary about knives in the future. So parts of these are innate. There's certain parts of your personality that you can't change, but you can be aware of and change your habits, your environment, the people around you, the temperature, and you can make good decisions about the risk that you take in different parts of your life.
have you seen one or two factors that stand out above the rest in shaping one's risk fingerprints? And the point of view that I'm asking this from is when you look at someone that's suffered through very grave circumstances and has come out on top, are they more prone and comfortable with getting out of their comfort zone and taking risks versus someone that may have grown up in a very middle class life and life's been fairly secure and there's a nice easy path, and I'll pick on the Indian diaspora for a second because I can. And so if you look in the Indian diaspora, a lot of the people who immigrated here, they carry the attitude of, for their kids, initially, that go become a doctor, go become an engineer. It's a safe bet, and you'll have a good life. And the thought of a child, it used to be, it's not so much anymore, but it certainly used to be, doing something crazy like trying to be a rock star or become an artist of some kind would be not looked upon that well, right? So, is there some circumstances that really shine, that change that risk appetite for people?
Well, I think it's more how they work together. There's some people who can have experience a big shock, and they're like, okay, well, I got through that. I can do anything. And you see some serial entrepreneurs who lose everything. They go bankrupt a bunch of times, and eventually they
Sure.
do well. And then there's some other people who have a big shock, and they are very conservative in the way they live their lives. Or, I talked to a couple of adult children of Holocaust survivors in the book, and
Okay.
those families, very, 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 very conservative in a lot of things. But it's funny that you mentioned the Indian Jazz Park is one of the characters in the book is a young man who I met in
Aurora, right?
Chicago. Yes, Agam Aurora, who, it's funny. I was gathering with a bunch of really, brilliant, and I would say, risk-seeking 20-somethings. And this was the early stages of the research of the book. And so I asked him, I said, okay, what's the biggest risk you've ever taken? And the room's kind of quiet for a couple of minutes. And so he raises his hand. He's like, oh, I quit medical school to become a stand-up comedian.
Yeah.
And then
That
everyone's like, how am I going to top that? But it was similar for him. His parents were doctors, and he'd been in medical school. It was sort of the quote unquote, safe path. It was the thing he was supposed to
Yep.
do. But he just absolutely hated it. And because he hated it, he wasn't very good at it. And eventually, he just said, forget it. He oversimplified the story a little bit, I'd say. I mean, like one of the first things he did was to try to be a stand-up comic while he was doing a bunch of other, jobs he found on Craigslist and all sorts of things. But it was an interesting set of circumstances for him because he had a very supportive family. They were able to support him financially. They were able to, support him with networks and say, we love you. We want you to do what makes you happy. And he went through a lot of sort of trial and error till he found a path. And so, which is a combination of a day job with some other philanthropic enterprises. So
Right.
it's very interesting that you happen to mention the Indian diaspora because he's one of my favorite characters from the book.
Well, you know what? It sounds like he has an exceptional family, right? Because for them to step up and say, we're going to support you, I think that changes the equation tremendously. If you're a young person with dreams and you have a safety net, that changes your appetite, I would imagine, to take risk in a very significant way. That may not be if you're surviving and you don't have that background, right?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, and it's a great illustration of how risk itself changes depending on your circumstances. I often describe it like a room full of funhouse mirrors. And a lot of us think about immigrants as being risk takers, or refugees. Get on a little raft going across shark infested waters. But you need to really ask yourself, okay, riskier than what? And if they're coming from a country with a lot of repression and conflict and poverty, like the odds of them dying if they stay where they are pretty high. In that case, getting on the boat, with the sharks is the lesser of the
Right.
two risks. Or you look at, say, the immigrant, arrives in a new country, and because a lot of jobs still are, through, networks, and you have to have certain sets of skills, and
Right.
you look at the skills available to you, and, immigrants often tend to go in places where there are other immigrants, and these sort of,
Right.
mom and pop stores or other industries that might be, particular to one group of immigrants. So you always hear, oh, immigrants are entrepreneurial, but, in many cases, it's a mom and pop kind of situation. Or you go to Silicon Valley, and you hear a lot actually about all of California, the percentage of these unicorn startups that were founded
Right.
by immigrants. It's through the roof. And I think some of that has to do with people having built up a sort of a risk muscle, this sort of, practice in doing something. So you go to a country you've never been to before, sometimes a country where you don't even speak the language. You become very practiced at doing things that are out of your comfort zone, that are totally new, that are uncertain, and you learn you can do more things. And the flip side of this is that you look at statistics on social entrepreneurs, and some crazy percentage of them are upper middle class kids, who've got the family backstop, so they don't have to go and earn a gazillion dollars before they can go and
Right.
and do their do-gooding. And that's actually a problem, because a lot of the people who've got great ideas and great experience with the communities that really need a lot of help don't necessarily have all this social capital to lean back on. And so it's a very important question, that how your background and your financial situation and your social setup affects your risk taking. But then again, some of these rich kids go and start social enterprises to save the world. Other of them just stay in their comfort zone, and then if something unexpected happens to them, they fall apart. So that's a real difference. There are some kids with this background who will go and take risks, and others who won't. So none of this is set in stone. It's a bunch of different factors affecting each other.
So, you write in your book about the millennials. Have we done the millennials a disservice? And I have a couple millennial children, but there was a generation that I don't think there's been a generation that had that organized a childhood ever. I don't. I mean, everything was super mega structured, and the outcomes were carefully crafted. And what has your findings shown about that group of people as it comes to risk now?
Yeah, it's so interesting talking about millennials, because if you go and Google millennials and risk, you see all these crazy headlines: millennials risk averse, most risk averse generation ever, blah blah blah. And you also see the stuff about the helicopter parenting, which I think has done a disservice. I mean, I look at the trick or treating I was allowed to do when I was a kid, or I'd ride my
Right.
bike all around and had a lot more freedom than I think a lot of the kids today do, and so
agree.
was taking more risks. So I do think that this helicopter parenting has in many ways hurt people who are raised that way. But at the same time, you've got this countervailing factor, which is that millennials have grown up with time with a big financial crisis, and well, they're older now, but Gen Z is dealing with the pandemic. But they grew up with a lot of uncertainty, with more student debt than their parents, with not as positive an outlook into the future. You look at investing right now, and obviously with all the money the Fed's been pumping into the market, it's been a fairly safe environment, because you just know there's all this money behind it, but that's going to turn around at some point.
Right.
And is it riskier to invest in a stock market that's 3 times the level it was a couple years? I think now it's 4 times or more,
Right.
or a stock market that's kind of been going along. So it's not the same risk. Or if you've got a ton of student loan debt and you're paying, I don't know what, 7-8% interest on that, and that by paying that down, you're automatically getting this sort of implied return of that 7-8% plus whatever the compounding.
Right.
And you see a stock market bubble, and you think, okay, well, what's the cost benefit here? So it's very, very different. So each generation goes through their own historical reality and their own set of calculations and influences on the risk decisions that they're making. And actually, this term risk averse drives me nuts in general, because it's often used unfairly and often pejoratively, towards millennials and towards women in general. And I've heard so many women, they're like, oh yes, I'm risk averse, not even really knowing what that means. The risk averse means that in the same circumstances, you'll take less risk, but the circumstances aren't always the same.
They're not always same. Yeah.
They're not always
And I'm
the
actually
same.
surprised to hear that. I think in some instances women may be better risk takers, but I
I certainly think so. Well, I talked before about this sort of, risk muscle. And one of the areas where some of the research suggests that women are more comfortable taking risk is in social risk, which is, speaking out and, saying something when nobody else will say it. And the thing about that is that for women, in many cases, women being the only woman in the room, and when they speak up, they risk being ignored or being told that they're bossy and too pushy, or they'll be ignored and 5 minutes later some guy says the same thing that they just said and everybody like applauds the guy, and the woman doesn't get credit and is called bossy. So women have a lot more practice taking social risks than than most men do. And when you're experienced taking a certain risk, when that muscle gets stronger, you actually get better at judging the situation. You get tougher. You just expect that you're always going to have negative consequences. You don't care as much. It doesn't hurt as much. So that whole equation around social risk and speaking up is very, very different for women than for men.
I'll tell you what, you should, if you look into women who are in cybersecurity, you might have some very interesting findings. So,
I am
one of
intrigued.
I'll give you a couple, one major point of reference that you may or may not be aware that women in cybersecurity make 30% more than their male counterparts
I did not know
financially.
that. I love
Yeah,
that.
it's an interesting little, diversion from the general trend. There's not as many women in the field, but the women that are in the field are highly qualified, and they're getting that money not because they're women, but because they're generally better qualified than a lot of the male applicants for the same type of role. And I've seen it that one of our top engineers, she's a threat hunter. Uh, when she starts talking, a lot of people listen because she really does know what she's talking about. And if you look on if you did a count of our playlist and look at the number of guests that we've had on the show that were women, um, it's a very, very significant percentage relative to the entire population that's been on the show. So I guess maybe cybersecurity is a place where women have found a place to excel and exceed.
That's great
And
to hear because you hear nightmare stories about tech in general, and so I'm very happy to hear that story.
oh yeah, I'll send you a link post the show to one of the episodes where we had one of the industry's top recruiters actually talk about some of the phenomena that are happening with women, and that's interesting. I guess one thing would be is if you are cognizant and self-aware of where your risk appetite is as an individual and you want to change it, do you have some practical advice on how you go about building that risk muscle, as the term that you put forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to add a little clarity around this term, risk appetite. There are all these terms that kind of get thrown around. There's sort of your risk tolerance. You can have two people with the same risk appetite, um, but the same very, very different amounts of risk tolerance. You might perceive risk to be a certain level. So, for example, there was a study of Chinese and American students, and everybody thought that the Chinese students, or that the American students would be, more risk seeking. So they gave them the option, do you want to get paid, 4% flat or variable between 0 and 8%, and the variable one supposedly being riskier.
Yep.
And they're actually much more similar than they expected, and everyone was surprised. But they went back and they realized that the Chinese students actually rated it as much less risky in the first place. So even though they were taking the exact same amount of risk compared to where they were comfortable, the people who saw less risk were actually taking less. Their risk tolerance in that case wasn't as high. And so, your risk appetite, how much risk you're willing to take also depends on how much risk you perceive. And risk perception is another one of these very slippery things, where that depends on how much control you feel you have, how much knowledge you feel that you have, whether you're doing it on your own or in a group, how much of a safety net you feel you have. And in many cases, that can be, how much risk you're taking in one part of your life versus the rest of your life. If you're going to quit your job and be an entrepreneur, you're going to be more comfortable with more risk if you have a nice big rainy day fund rather than if you
Right.
don't. So,
Absolutely.
personal financial risk versus the, career risk. So this is all, very, very slippery. But two of the things that I think can help a lot are, one, knowledge. Study whatever it is that you are going to be taking a risk in, and look at a variety of sources and get a number of opinions. Actually, some of the research that I cite about entrepreneurs is that, entrepreneurs often have done more homework around whatever it is they're trying to do. So that knowledge makes them more confident, assuming that, what they've learned is positive for whatever they're going into. But knowledge also makes you feel like you have more control, so that you're more likely to, to be more comfortable with a higher amount of risk. The other part is having people around you who can give you good advice about whatever that risk is going to be, and people from very different backgrounds, and also people who are willing to take the social risk of telling you what you don't want to hear. I was talk about the Aquafina character in Crazy Rich Asians. The best friend who's like, don't wear that stupid dress.
Yeah.
So those, the knowledge and the environment, and also if it's a specific decision, you can look at your physical environment. Like, say you want to go ask your boss for a raise and you're a little nervous about that. Well, take your boss out for Thai food, order the spiciest dish on the menu, tell them to crank up the air conditioning so it's really cold, and have them put some sort of quick tempo music on. So that'll get
you really want to
up.
get this person out of their comfort zone.
Yeah, exactly. Well, what's interesting is, that's all the research shows, that if it's colder, you're going to be more likely to take risks. There's some studies with birds, like when it's colder, obviously the birds are going to work harder to get food and take more risk to get food because they're afraid there's not going to be as much of it. And then, the spicy foods is so interesting. There are all sorts of stereotypes around, people who like spicy food. And I think there is a chicken and the egg thing, because the more you eat spicy food, the more comfortable you're likely to be with certain risks for the few hours after you eat it. But spice also has its own risk reducing factors. I mean, that in really, really hot countries, they put the hot peppers to, kill the kind of things that might grow in there without refrigeration, or, in some cases it's to hide the taste of whatever that is, in which case it is increasing the risk because you're eating something you don't know how bad it is. But, so there are actually weird logical explanations for some of these things. But if it is a single risk you need to take on a certain day, look at your environment. Are you comfortable? Are you doing it before lunch or after lunch? And what did you eat for lunch?
That's great advice. I didn't know that. I'll have to do that with a client sometime and test this theory out. They may not want to have dinner with me ever again, but what the heck, go out for some really spicy Thai food, which is delicious. But
I love Thai food. It's so good.
Yeah, it's a separate story. But yeah, that's very interesting. Is there neurobiologically are people built differently, where some people are inherently able to compartmentalize the notions of risk very differently than others, and break it down into a level where they're like, worst case, oh well, it's okay.
Well, the research on the genetics of it and the neurobiology is not as clear cut as you would hope. There's some research around the relationship between dopamine and risk taking, but it's it's very unclear how much is genetic and how much is not. Um, but so the I think some of the genetic influence, the neurobiological influence, I would also almost call like more, innate personality rather than the
Okay.
specific neurobiology of it. And that's, some people are going to be calmer about things. I mean, you look at siblings and they're going to come at things from very different attitudes.
Absolutely.
There is some research about birth order, which also doesn't affect things as much as you might guess. I mean, I'm an oldest child.
So am I.
Yay, oldest child, You get to play banker when you play Monopoly,
That's
it's
right.
all the
You
benefits
get
of
to
it.
put the cards in the clue
But
thing.
then again, like your parents experiment with you, and I remember being really, really mad that like seeing the younger kids with bedtimes that were later than mine was when I was their own age, because I guess my parents figured it out. And you
Well,
have all these other responsibilities when you're oldest child. So, they're different, they're really different influences, but really, each person has got their own set of things. And I think the biggest determinant is really how aware you are. I get asked all the time, is there an ideal risk personality type? And
yeah.
my answer is no, but, what are the ideal circumstances that correspond to that type? There's certain careers that will attract people with similar risk types. There you want to see if your environment really fits, if you're comfortable with it. If you're somebody who is very methodical and you tend to be a little bit anxious and not so crazy about change, then maybe you want to go work for one of these big bureaucratic corporations and not a startup where you're not going to be so happy.
Right.
But if you are comfortable with change, if you're, pretty calm about dealing with risks, and, um, you know, sometimes you're methodical, it means you go and prepare everything, which actually reduces the risk, or maybe you are more of an impulsive type. And, startup's going to be a much better environment for you. So what you want to do is think about the people around you. If you're the kind of person who goes and leaps before you look, well, maybe you want a best friend who can dial it down a little bit. And if you're a shrinking violet, you want a sort of a courageous best friend. I mean, I remember when I was in middle school, I was like super shy, and I had a good friend who was just, I went to a private school and I was super nerdy, A student. She went to a public school, and she was much more comfortable in lots of situations than I was. I was like really grateful to have a best friend like that who had a different relationship with the world and who I could kind of hide behind if I was a little scared. And so it worked out. In that case, opposites attracted.
So bring some contrast to your life.
Yes.
That's
And practice getting out of your comfort zone. There's one guy I interviewed he'd been training he wanted to be a professional athlete. And he had a terrible knee injury. So he'd been spending all this time like not having a social life because he was training all the time. And all of a sudden, he's like, he can't have this career he's been putting everything into. And he had to figure out what was next. And he knew that he was not comfortable in social situations. So he went and deliberately put himself into situations that were strange. I mean, he had these sort of odd jobs where, you're promoting a movie or something, you dress up in a weird costume, or you go out and, hand out flyers to people, or, he'd make himself go and sit next to someone, next to a stranger in a bar, which was like way not his comfort zone. And he's actually a life coach now. But
I was going to say, I would hope that person was immensely successful, because I would have bet that they were going to be very successful.
I had such a great conversation, a series of conversations with him. And he had a lot of really good advice. And he also talked about the importance of really knowing your values and your purpose. He was coaching couples for a while. Actually, he'd been a relationship coach before
Wow.
before he broadened. And he talked about the kind of risks that you're taking if you're in a relationship with someone who doesn't care about the same things that you do. You want to make sure that you understand which values you're willing to put at risk and which ones not. And finding someone who's compatible, who fits with your risk fingerprint.
So I'm going to change topics here real quick because I do want to address this because I think our listeners are going to want to understand it. Is that if you look at companies, when we help a company define risk, there's a lot of quantitative analysis that happens, and you look at probability and likelihood of loss and multiply it together and say this is what's going to happen. That's great, but ultimately, what we have seen intuitively is that an organization's risk fingerprint, so not in individuals, but in organizations, is somewhat of the sum of a lot of the fingerprints that comprise that organization. And you could do all the quantitative analysis in the world, but if there's not that emotional connection made to that organization's collective, it won't really matter. It just won't matter. How do you, as a leader in the organization, change your organization's risk fingerprint? Because you realize a lot of the things that may be in play may be adverse to taking on certain risks that the organization needs to succeed.
Well, I think some of it has to do with the sort of leading from the top, the example that you set, not only the risks you take, but the organization, and actually increasingly people are realizing that, the personal risks that you take as well have a lot of significance for your organization. The cheating on your spouse, the drunk driving, the throwing a tantrum if the kind of tequila you want is not available. um, those sort of things are also signaling to your organization, that they have a leader who is providing a risk umbrella that's going to, that's going to protect them or not. So that's the beginning. Having a CEO with a healthy risk relationship, having a board that's willing to ask the right questions about risk. And then, in the recruiting process of the organization, figure out what your mix is and if that's ideal. If you're an organization that sees yourself as innovating, and you have a bunch of, bureaucrats at heart, and if you don't have the kind of people who are willing to take the social risk of speaking out and saying, hey, there's a gray rhino we need to talk about, you need to change that risk. So that means that the recruiting processes need to change. I'm sure you've read a lot about the importance of diversity for good decision making, for
Right. Diversity of thought is super important.
and for marketing, making sure you've got people on your team who know what your customers are going to think about or be worried about. But a lot of that doesn't explicitly take into account risk, risk fingerprints and risk attitudes. And so I think that in the recruiting process, you do want to think a little bit more about, how does this person think about risk? And you can ask questions like, what's the biggest risk you ever taken? What's the biggest risk you've ever not taken? Here's a couple of risk scenarios. What would you do? You kind of get a sense of who would be willing to, risk customer safety in order to get a bigger quarterly bonus or not. Maybe that's not the person you want to hire.
Right.
But a lot of it is, explicitly thinking about your team's comfort with taking risks, their ability to take smart risks, to really evaluate the cost benefit and the probabilities of various outcomes, their ability to adjust their behavior to reduce those risks, because you can assign a number to the probability of some sort of risk, but that's got to change if you feel like your team is prepared for dealing with it or not. And really think about the culture that you want, and how your people support that or don't, how the incentives that you give them support good risk taking or not. This sort of the ethical environment that you are projecting and supporting through your key performance incentives and things like that.
I'm going to be curious to see the comments we get from our listeners on that last bit there. Because you're absolutely right. But it's also everything you said, I would characterize as a big, giant gray rhino right here. That's a hard conversation.
It is. It's the kind of thing I call a meta gray rhino, a sort of a, structural situation that you need to resolve if you want to be really effective at addressing the individual gray rhinos that are coming at you. And this whole decision making, organizational culture, strategy, ethics, those are all huge meta gray rhinos that companies need to pay attention to.
Absolutely. Well, we are at the hour, and we want to give you a chance to plug some things. You've been gracious enough to share some great advice with us. Anything you'd like to plug? We'll have links to your book, by the way. We'll put them in the show notes.
Love that.
Yeah.
Well, for people who want to learn more, my website is thegrayrhino.com. Gray with an A. E will get you there too. You can find out more about both the Grey Rhino and You Are What You Risk. People have asked me which one to read first, and Grey Rhino is really more about the analyzing the event itself, and You Are What You Risk is about the personality. You can follow me on Twitter at Wooker, Wucker, and you can also find me on LinkedIn, where I have a newsletter that comes out you can sign up for called Around My Mind, that comes out sometimes more regularly than other times, but hopefully more regularly in the future.
That's great. We'll put links to all of those in the show notes, and we'll make sure that when we publish this, which will be this coming Monday, we'll have links to your Twitter handles and everything else there as well. And fantastic work you're doing. We look forward to hearing a lot more from you. I'll also put a link to you. You did a great TED Talk. I'm going to put a link to that in there as well. I think it would be really well advised for them to take a listen as to what you had to say. And I think what you're doing is making a difference, and we're all appreciative of that. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you. It's really been a pleasure to talk with you today.